for today's ASCE Texas section webinar titled Beyond Storms, Are We Prepared Yet? This is an update from our Texas Electric Grid Committee that was born out of the crisis created by the twin storms of 2021. If you're not a member of ASCE or the Texas section, I invite you to become a member so that you can benefit from being a part of this professional association and the gratifying and meaningful volunteer opportunities it offers. And I speak from personal experience on that. Our webinar program is very fortunate to have two distinguished presenters today. They're repeat presenters to this webinar series, Jeffrey Roberts and Oliver Smith. Geoff Roberts is the current chair of the ASCE Texas Section Beyond Storms Committee, this committee. He is a civil engineer with 40 years of experience in the energy and water industry from electricity, natural gas, water, and liquid products sectors. His roles have ranged from operations to asset development, M&A trading, and origination to executive leadership positions. He's been fortunate to both work and live overseas, which has allowed him his first-hand experience with the various energy markets on 5 continents across the globe. And he's seen solutions that work and those that don't work for sure. Oliver Smith, a native Texan, was born and raised on the campus of Prairie View A&M. He has been a civil engineer for 47 years and joined ASCE in his junior year of college at Michigan State University. His early experience in oil and natural gas facility construction and production operations led him to join the 24 volunteers who prepared the analysis and recommendations you're seeing today. He has worked in several business environments and guided actions to improve the reliability and resilience of the processes that enabled those businesses to deliver projects, products, and services economically and in a timely fashion. I'll be watching the Q&A board for questions, which I'll read out loud to our presenters for their responses addressed during, and that they'll address during the final 10 minutes or so of the session. However, Mr. Roberts or Mr. Smith can see the questions also and may choose to address any particular question if it seems convenient or timely as they do so in real time. Otherwise, we'll certainly address your questions towards the end. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Geoff and Oliver. Take it away, guys.
Good afternoon. President Abraham Lincoln once said, if I had 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 6 hours sharpening my axe. The implied meaning behind this famous quotation is that if you have a problem to solve, invest enough time sharpening your understanding of the problem before beginning to address it. As we have had 2.42 years since the near collapse of the venerable Texas electrical grid, and now the atmospheric heat dome continues to stress the capacity of the grid to accommodate the demand for extended periods of air conditioning, you can reasonably ask the question, are we chopping the tree, sharpening the axe, or looking for the file? In other words, exactly where are we as an independent electrical grid in the effort to establish reliability and resilience for the consumers of electrical power in the state of Texas? Over the next 40 minutes, Geoff and I will bring you up to date on the progress being made in improving both the electrical grid and civil infrastructure, as well as the issues that remain to be addressed. Our approach will be to highlight key aspects of the recent weather extremes and other factors that have impacted Texas infrastructure and consequently Texas citizens and businesses. We will review the original findings of the February 2022 Beyond Storms report and offer updated recommendations that were shared with legislators during the April 2023 Texas American Society of Civil Engineers legislative drive-in. It is important to remember that the February 2021 winter storms that highlighted shortcomings in the ways the integrated Texas infrastructure handles disruptions were not the first time that a massive disruption occurred with the electrical power generation segment of the Texas infrastructure. Back in 2011, a significant portion of the North Texas power generation infrastructure was taken offline by a localized winter storm. The ensuing analysis by the Public Utilities Commission of Texas recommended weatherization of generation facilities to withstand long periods of cold temperatures and icy precipitation. Regrettably, no actions were taken to actively implement the recommendations, and the inclement weather scenario was repeated 10 years later, only this time on a scale that encompassed the entire state. The impacts were considerably more disastrous in lives lost, economic impacts, and lingering costs that are being underwritten today by ratepayers. The costs exceeded the impacts of the two most expensive hurricanes, the normal mode of destructive Texas weather impact in US history, Harvey and Katrina. Texas homeowners and businesses spend approximately $101 million per day for retail electric power. That's $37 billion a year. So the impact of almost losing the grid substantially exceeded the normal costs of buying power on an annual basis. While there was initially a tendency to blame the weather for the extreme outcomes of February 2021, the reality is that winter storms Uri and Viola simply uncovered lingering issues of market dynamics, interdependence, and preparedness for disruptions to critical infrastructure operations. Texas ASCE has endeavored through the 2 years we engaged in analyzing, that is, sharpening our saw, the events of February 2021 to understand the underlying root causes of the near collapse of the grid and the significant disruptions to critical infrastructure, so as to not oversimplify the causes or recommend the silver bullet type of response. In our interactions with Texas legislators, members of staff, we have elected to focus initially on market expectations for critical infrastructure. That is, critical infrastructure shall be reliable, that is, functioning effectively on demand, whether we are flipping a light switch, turning on the tap for potable water, or dialing a number on our mobile phone. Second, critical infrastructure should feature a resilience that is built in to assure robust response when the inevitable disruption is experienced. Quick recovery from a disruption is what determines the difference between an inconvenience and a disaster. Infrastructure that is interdependent, as is the case in all societies, demands that reliability and resilience exist within and between the elements of the system that support life and commerce. The emphasis on reliability and resilience assures the integrated systems provide the highest level of resistance to disruptive events, protecting life and economy as a desired outcome. Now I'll turn it over to Geoff to deal with our current observations of the state of the Texas infrastructure. Geoff?
Thank you, Oliver. What we wanted to start with was at the core of our original findings. And we're describing it now as a pyramid of reliability and resilience. Think of it like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where the higher levels are dependent upon the strengths of the levels below. Starting at the bottom is a need for a fail-safe backup. This is a purpose of black start generators. They serve when all else fails. They are the sprinkler system in the event of a fire. They're that last line of defense. And that's only when the things above break. The next part of the foundation is revenue sufficiency. So what is revenue sufficiency? Well, no matter how well you build infrastructure, if you fail to adequately pay to operate and maintain it, it will fail. If the infrastructure is asked to perform differently than it was originally designed, most likely additional investment will be required to ensure that that infrastructure remains fit for purpose. And this applies to all types of infrastructure, whether it be energy, whether it be roads, ports, airports, etc. The next phase, which Oliver touched on, is interdependence. Interdependence occurs when the reliability of one sector of infrastructure is dependent upon the reliability of another sector for its reliability. So for example, the water sector is reliant on the electric sector to treat and pump drinking water. If the electric sector fails, if the water utility does not have backup, then effectively this interdependence creates a cascading type of a problem. So the failure to address this issue at scale, which can, interesting enough, can often be hidden and created from a series of small, discrete decisions, what we term interdependence creep, can lead to cascading failures. And it's one where the incremental decision feels small, feels isolated, but when you aggregate it and you have 1,000 or 10,000 replications of that same decision, now you've gone from a discrete risk to a systemic risk. And this is where interdependence really raises its head. The next one is ensuring that reliability and resilience-centric rules and regulation. This is, unfortunately, it's a low-cost priority that's often ignored, problems hidden in plain sight. Rules and regulations must be written to ensure that they are reliability and resilience-centric in their outcomes. Poorly structured rules can actually result in a degradation of reliability and resilience. Lastly, on top of all of this are the people and the culture that contribute to reliability and resilience. They need to be aligned with the foundation of the organization or the foundation of the reliability pyramid to ensure that the processes, the decision-making, et cetera, is all circular in its reinforcement of reliability and resilience. There's a lot of information on this page. What we wanted to do was to step back, take a look at what were our top network recommended actions from the first time around. It basically seeks to distill in a snapshot the current situation against the original reliability and resilience recommendations from the original report. We elected to use stoplights to provide an indicative representative assessment of the progress made to date and the amount remaining to achieve the desired outcome. When we developed our recommendations, we recognize that these are very complex issues that can be solved in many ways. We provided a background of what happened and why it happened, and identified the required outcomes needed to ultimately resolve the issues. We made a conscious decision, however, to defer to industry, the public, its legislators and regulators to develop how the problem gets solved. There are lots of different ways to solve a problem. And unfortunately, while undeniable progress has been made, the most critical components required for reliability and resilience have failed to be adequately addressed. We'll start first with black start generation. Part of the challenge that we have here is it remains unclear due to the increased levels of public disclosure restrictions on whether revenue sufficiency has been established to ensure that these critical units, and remember, these are the units that when all else fails, helps to restore the grid. So the importance for them to be reliable in a variety of different conditions is absolutely critical to ensuring that the system continues to function. During the winter storms of Viola and Uri, we were 4.5 minutes away from black start conditions. And that is a dire situation for Texans or anyone else to be confronting. So it remains uncertain. We know that dual fuel capability was expanded within this sector. That means that not only can it be provided by natural gas, but it also has backup alternative fuel, typically a liquid fuel on site, to ensure that regardless of what happens to the system around it, these units can continue to run. We also know that there was incremental investment in weatherization. However, the full extent is not publicly available, or the ability of this fleet to consistently perform at the top decile level. Think of it like a fire suppression system. You want to make sure that operates when you need it. And it's the same thing with black start generation. It's absolutely critical that these units perform as a very best in class type of availability and reliability. And it's unknown, unconfirmed, whether they've actually made all the necessary investments to ensure that. The next one, next item over, is revenue insufficiency. These are basically flaws that basically negatively impact dispatchable generation reliability. The way ERCOT is structured as an energy-only model meant that only those units that were being dispatched, regardless of the value that they provide to the system in the form of reliability, were not being compensated for that reliability. And the result was underinvestment. And when you have underinvestment, you're not satisfying the revenue requirements. Reliability of dispatchable generation really results in a system that runs until it breaks, usually under stress. And it shows up in a lot of different ways. It shows up in a lack of weatherization because the economics, the forward market did not support that investment. So it was really critical for the changes that were needed in the grid and the system rules that this issue of revenue insufficiency was directly addressed. The next one, mitigating the growing interdependence between infrastructure sectors. I think from our perspective, from what we've seen, this is why we gave it a yellow light, was we have seen limited action on addressing the growing interdependence, but it was typically around a specific sector. So for example, the water industry taking steps to ensure they had backup generation and fuel supply, et cetera. Same thing on the telecom or the roads and pre-positioning supplies and infrastructure. You saw it on the upstream sector, where there's been additional both insulation of upstream assets, particular wellheads, et cetera, but also you've seen a better following through on processes on those that are designated as loads that are critical to the system. And that's all showing, again, positive progress. However, there's been no clear systemic focus outside of these individual silos that really address this from a macro perspective and start to capture, well, now wait a minute, we're doing these things over here, but that's creating another problem over there. And so that lack of systemic focus beyond the individual sectors creates, in our view, some significant risks with ongoing interdependency. And interdependency is one of those areas that constantly changes, constantly evolves. So it's important to get it right. The last one, regulations, processes, model biases that basically sacrifice reliability. In the case of the ERCOT energy-only model, the pursuit of short-term price reductions with reliability and resilience prioritized later is a problem. And we believe that it's absolutely critical. And in our discussions with ERCOT, with PUC, with industry, there's clearly a recognition of the need for this. The challenge is the actions. And the core problem of revenue insufficiency has yet to be fully addressed through regulatory change. And you saw some of that come forward in some of the political battles, I'll describe them, between legislature, between PUC, between ERCOT, all of those coming together. And but it was ultimately left unresolved. And our view is that this is a significant enough piece that it is considered an existential threat risk to a reliable and resilient grid. So, as we've gone through all that, in our refreshed analysis of the situation, we asked ourselves the question, are we prepared? The simple answer, unfortunately, is no. So now our challenge is, what is needed and what is it that we can do about it? We believe any solution starts with this focus on reliability and resilience. And I will note this is an example where I think ASCE really stepped out and focused on an issue that was least parochial. Almost all the other participants had an axe to grind, an ox to avoid being gored, whatever, however you want to describe it. And we were out there very consistently around the focus on reliability and resilience. And here's some further background. Since its formation as a competitive energy-only market, ERCOT has lacked a transparent, robust, and enforceable reliability and resilience standard. This failure to adopt a robust and enforceable reliability standard allowed the ERCOT market to ignore a series of early warning signs and indicators for well over a decade, creating, in essence, an increasingly fragile system. Without a reliability compass, what we'll describe it as, to help navigate its way, ERCOT got lost. ERCOT defaulted to a more myopic focus on short-term low cost, while obstinately ignoring the signs of growing reliability and resilience problems. There is active discussion underway, but unfortunately, there's no clear resolution that's visible. So what's needed? We believe first and foremost is that PUC and ERCOT need to establish a transparent, a robust, and an enforceable reliability standard. So what does that mean? Well, the performance metric should be transparent. It should be clear and it should be understandable. And it should be neutral or agnostic to the type of resource. So for example, if you are looking for a performance metric for generation, the same thing ought to be applied to demand side management. So whether it's generation or demand, supply or demand, they ought to be treated equally. In addition, we should proactively ensure that revenue sufficiency for dispatchable resources are confirmed with evidence of market response. Are those investments being made? Is new generation being attracted in the market to ensure that we have reliability on a long-term basis? If it isn't, that's an indicator that we have an issue. It's either the market is not attractive enough to attract incremental investment, or it may be that there's too much uncertainty about that market. It's also critical to apply to any dispatchable resource, again, supply or demand, with consistent financial rewards and penalties for performance that encourage verified and efficient investments. If a dispatchable resource during the winter needs to have firm supply for fuel, then either it should be able to point to where it has firm transport or it has on-site storage and capability for that. Is just one example of that. And the last one is that all dispatchable and non-dispatchable resources with a capacity of greater than 100 megawatts, or the equivalent if it was demand response, should be required to meet similar structural standards. So for example, if there's a wind load standard for generation, that ought to apply to all of the generators. There shouldn't be someone able to, oh, we built our facility X to a different standard, a lighter standard. We don't need to be as reliable as the others. Well, that's where we start to get into problems. And then in addition, to be able to do that in operating in the various weather conditions that are present throughout the state, both summer and winter. And lastly, and this is something we kept coming across from a variety of the industry, especially with some of the supply chain issues, is that it's absolutely imperative to maintain timely access to minimum critical spares to ensure reliable performance and resilience operation. And if the most consequential events occur, we want to make sure we're prepared. And so, for example, in talking with some generators where they identify, well, if we are out, we don't carry a spare for this, and it's an 18-month delay. Wow. How does the grid respond to that? And if they're all in a similar situation, how could we maybe pool some of those resources? All of those solutions are out there, but it's important to identify and recognize that there should be a requirement around the minimal critical spares. So again, it begins. The robust and transparent reliability standard is foundational to meeting reliability and resilience. It provides a compass to navigate to the balance of the changes needed. So this becomes your touchstone as you work through each one of these processes. If you come back and say and ask the question, does it address reliability? Does it help with the standard and the performance of that standard, the metrics of that standard? Then you've probably solved the issue. So in light of all this, and in light of what we know today, what are the remaining top network recommended actions? We'll start with investing in black start generation. This is critical to have this fallback, this fail safe. And it starts first with confirming revenue sufficiency has been established to ensure that these critical units are maintained, have dual fuel capability confirmed, and that black start generators are obligated to perform at the top decile reliability levels. If they are unable to, they should be replaced. On resolving the revenue insufficiency regulation, those flaws that negatively impact dispatchable generation reliability, well, it begins with transparent and enforceable reliability standard, and in turn is supported by a clear and transparent revenue sufficiency. And ultimately, the regulatory and ERCOT system model should be adjusted to accommodate that. You'll ultimately know whether this is working if those investments are being made, and if new generation investments, in this case, could be also investments on the demand side, are brought to bear on solving this issue, because it's telling you, okay, the market is responding to the solution. Mitigating growing interdependency between infrastructure sectors. This is a little bit of a challenging one, but I think it begins with a high level recognition of the problem and the proposed actions to address interdependency issues beyond or outside of that single sector. We need to continue to obviously support weatherization and efficiency of demand, et cetera, but we also need to make sure that as we typically look at our typical silos, that we also look in between those silos, where we have a lot of risks that can grow quietly, out of sight, out of mind, but ultimately can lead to cascading types of problems later on. And that requires an ability to step back and look at the forest beyond just the trees that we're normally focused on. Lastly, replacing regulations, process, and model biases that sacrifice reliability. So left unresolved, revenue insufficiency is a large enough challenge to be considered an existential risk to a reliable and resilient grid. Legislation, processes, and models need to be regularly challenged, validated, and adjusted or corrected to ensure that reliability signals are identified for action, and ultimately that action is taken. So with that, we'd like to turn it over to the group for questions.
Well, we're way ahead of schedule.
We are.
We are. It's fine, and we can turn back part of the afternoon to everybody, but we do have a couple of questions here. Oh, Jenny says that's a great looking chart. It's not a question.
Thanks, Jenny.
Does anybody have any questions? So far, nothing. I think you took everybody by surprise. Usually we get the questions at the end and they were expecting a few more minutes. So we'll give them a minute or two. Let me seed a question for you guys. Being part of this committee, but not particularly active recently we haven't had too many discussions that I've been involved in. The answer, are we ready, is no. But is the news that the committee has seen some improvement since we were formed back in 2021?
Geoff, I'll let you start and then I'll
Okay.
go to the
in.
legislative part.
All right, sounds good. So I think, Mark, in answer to your question, there's no question that there's been progress made in a variety of different areas. Even, for example, on Black Start generation, we know that there were incremental investments made, for example, in dual fuel capability. For those that may just be coming to this issue, large majority of the Black Start generators, which are again our fail-safe for the grid, were reliant solely on natural gas. And in many instances, that gas supply was actually acquired on an interruptible basis. So having dual fuel capability and having that second fuel, that typically liquid fuel available on site, is a very positive step forward, along with weatherization and making those investments. So those are two great examples of where there's absolutely been progress made. There's been progress made on some of the interdependency issues. There are a lot of issues identified between the electric and the gas industry in particular, and that resulted with identification of a critical infrastructure, putting in rules around which ones get interrupted or not, and we avoid some of the issues that were there before. Oliver, I'm sure, will have some very specific numbers around that topic, but all of that was, half of it is starting to uncover what's there. One thing that I think has also happened, is a more subtle one to uncover, is you had a number of industries that were very insular. They knew how their industry worked, but it was actually kind of surprising at the lack of awareness, for example, between the electric and the natural gas industries, how little common understanding they had of each other's world. And I think that is a changing. It doesn't happen overnight, but that's a very positive, part of, understanding in an emergency is understanding what's the reality, what can or can't we do. And so I think that's a very positive trend. I think you've also seen more training. It's like any kind of disaster preparation. Part of it is taking those steps early and practicing, and you're starting to see that. That's again another positive thing, and lots of little decisions. I think I guess the takeaway would be there has been absolutely positive progress in addressing areas that were left ignored or unaddressed previously. The challenge that we see is that some of the most difficult problems to solve have been the ones that have remained unsolved or partially solved. And those are the ones that we raise concerns about and want to ensure that actions are taken to address those. Oliver?
Legislatively, there was a lot of activity during the 88th Texas congressional session, but the two bills that actually passed were incremental in the way that they address the infrastructure needs for the state of Texas. One being allocating $10 billion to low interest loans to attract dispatchable generation. The other being the effort to incentivize more what we would call distributed power. Distributed power meaning finding ways for solar and independent power generation operations to collectively come together and sell power into ERCOT. So there was an interest in or legislation that advanced that approach to incentivizing independent power generation, including homeowners with solar, to sell into the network. What we would have liked to have seen would have been a bit more legislation around the demand side. In other words, work to invest in insulation and more efficient air conditioning systems for homeowners, which is where a great deal of energy is sacrificed. And demand management, such as incentivizing homeowners to purchase or receive thermostats that allow for the electric utility from which they are drawing power to adjust the thermostats when demand is high. That is a common feature in Europe for both the conditioning of air and the heating of water in order to control the demand on the grid.
All right.
With that, I'll allow Mark to give us a couple of questions.
Oliver, yeah, we have some questions from the audience now that we've given them a chance to think on this. From Otis Foster, who's one of our newest committee members. Do the recommendations comply with the ASCE ethics code requirements to adhere to the principles of sustainable development?
Yes. We have consistently worked to advocate, particularly as Geoff pointed out, when he stated that we are agnostic in our desire to address the sources of power generation that is focused on sustainability.
Yeah, and I think as it deals to the core of sustainability, and I think if we probably asked everybody online, everyone would probably have a slightly different definition of what sustainability is. But I think from an infrastructure perspective, part of the core of that sustainability is also its revenue sufficiency over its life. Is it being adequately maintained and operated appropriately? And that is part of the equation. This approach that unfortunately is often encountered across all of the infrastructure sectors, where it is a run to fail. It is kicking the can down the road. It is borrowing funds that are so critically needed, whether it be in upgrading and maintaining the water system or roads or bridges or whatever, and somebody else will come in and fix it later. The unfortunate reality of that is it often costs typically 4 to 5 times or more the cost of proactive maintenance on that. So from a sustainability perspective, there's an aspect of that absolutely underwrites everything, every sector as an issue. And I would agree, Oliver, with your other point.
I've got a question from Julie Hunt. Can you describe any state legislative actions that will assist in moving the industry towards adopting any of these recommendations? And you might have already addressed some of these, but do you have a couple that really speak to you?
I don't have my legislative bills sheet in front of me, but I will respond to that question after the session when I can pull the legislation out. But there was at least one bill that specifically addressed the question that you asked, Julie.
In addition, I think too that certainly some of these, some of them feel like you're coming in the middle of a conversation, right? Because these are things that are underway. So for example, the reliability standard is one that is underway. It still feels that you have some just extreme views that haven't started to consolidate yet. And whether that direction will ultimately need the legislature to come in to push that, it will depend upon what starts to gel and what comes out would be a good example. So some of it may not necessarily be ready for that. On others, I think we also, again, from our perspective, that some of the solutions may in fact have been, I'll use the term, maybe a little heavy-handed. And we're going to create a situation that was actually, if you, again, from a reliability and resilience standpoint, could have resulted in making the system worse, sending the wrong price signals, et cetera, that are counter to what the objective are. Again, it was we want to be careful about not saying how it ought to be fixed, more identifying what needs to fix and then what the outcome of that fix looks like. But there were clearly some gaps and some canyons, maybe would be the right way to describe it, between the PUC and ERCOT and the legislators that were ultimately not necessarily fully resolved. So I expect that to be continued. But specific language, I think the team has done a really good job on the outreach side and educating. Some of these issues, they're tough issues. And unfortunately, what ends up happening with a lot of this is Uri and Viola seems like a long time ago. Those issues we had, the coldest weather ever last year. Well, not really. Even the heat, look, we're getting through this heat. We don't have an issue. We'll focus on another problem. And I think, like with anything, when you're dealing with a large, complex problem, one of our biggest challenges is trying to keep up the momentum, keep up the education, and keep up the focus on the reality of, well, no, we haven't fixed that yet. This still needs to get done. And we just have to keep out there pushing it. Oliver, anything further to add?
I will simply say that Geoff's latter comments reflect on on Senate Bill number 6, which intended to build roughly 10 gigawatts of electric power that would be owned by the state. And that did not pass, even though it was a priority bill. And thankfully it did not, because as Geoff mentioned, it would have sent the wrong signal to the market. The state owning 10 gigawatts, the equivalent of 3 WA parish power stations outside of Houston, and expecting that having that much power sitting in theory waiting to be used in an emergency would definitely send the wrong signal to the investment market. And as a consequence, that did not move forward. So there was some good action in avoiding doing some things that would have made the situation in our electric grid worse.
Okay, I've got a couple other questions from the same, from Otis Foster. I'm going to combine them. The recommendations seem to encourage fossil fuel use and discourage wind and solar. Did wind and solar have significant negative impacts during Winter Storm Uri and Viola compared to the negative impacts from the natural gas energy resources? In addition to having goals of having a reliable cost, and this is a related question, in addition to having goals of having a reliable, cost-efficient, and resilient grid, would it be appropriate to include a goal of environmentally sound electric grid? Before you guys answer that, I'm going to remind that I was on the firing line with some other people on the report card that gave the electric grid a B+ grade right before the winter storms hit. I think that the committee was born on the expectation to provide recommendations towards the public expectation that our electric grid won't kill or injure people or cause severe damage in its failure against things like those winter storms and perhaps severe summers. And we weren't really focused towards the overall systemic fixes that might be needed, although the part of that B+ grade was that Texas is a leader in innovative renewable energy development. But because of the lack of storage capacity right now, the committee doesn't see that as being the solution to keep the grid from failing in such a way that it would kill or injure a lot of people. What do you two guys say to this?
Geoff?
So yeah, let me start with I think it's a misperception that we're somehow advocating fossil versus wind or solar. I think what we're really going to the heart of around this reliability and resilience issue is dispatchable versus non-dispatchable. Dispatchable includes a lot of different sources of generation. Natural gas happens to be one, coal is one, nuclear is one, hydro is one, geothermal is another one. They're basically plants that you can turn on and you can direct how much energy it's producing or not, versus the non-dispatchable, where it is the energy resource that is dictating how much energy that particular asset is putting out. And when you look at the way our society has worked, and the expectations of people, they expect lights to be on when you flip the switch. And they expect not only that the energy will be there when they turn that switch, but also that it will be in the quantity that they need. That is a reality of where we are. What we saw with Uri and Viola were the tremendous economic impacts of the failure of reliability and resilience on the grid. So for example, our estimate in addressing how do we solve this, how much does it cost to really solve this? The conclusion that we came up to was somewhere around a 5% increase in costs would have addressed a majority of the reliability and resilience issues. 5%, we'll round up, make the math easy, call it $40 billion a year in electricity. So about $2 billion it would have cost to ensure that those dispatchable plants, the ones that come on and run when you tell them to, or turn off when you tell them to, that we're standing by ready to provide that backup, we're ready and available. That's what the cost would have been to be able to provide that. Instead, we kind of ignored that, and we spent, on an emergency basis, we spent somewhere between $200 and $300 billion of damage from not having that in place. So I think that's an important, it's a relatively inexpensive set of or amount of insurance. And I think it's also important, there's a lot of, again, misinformation that this committee uncovered as they were looking through the data. And it was one of the most interesting things that came out, and it was confirmed in a FERC, NERC, so Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, North Electric Reliability Council. They both were looking at the issues coming out of this and determined that over 70% of the gas-fired power plants that had problems because they were relying on either interruptible gas transportation and or interruptible gas supply. And when the system is stressed and it's a cold environment and it's demanded for residential heating, or there are other markets that are better, that gas is going to be interrupted. And so then we asked the logical question, well, why? For something that's so important, because your plant doesn't run if it doesn't have fuel, why were those decisions made? That brought us back to the revenue sufficiency issue, and the fact that there were neither the incentives for an electric generator to step up for firm supply or firm transport, or both ideally, or storage right nearby, or a variety of different ways to solve it, or dual fuel capability, because there was a lack of revenue sufficiency. So I think that and that's not to say the natural gas industry did not have failures, because they did. The lack of upstream weatherization, the increased interdependency, switching from basically what was before isolated systems that managed, heat tracing and things like that, to going directly off the grid for that. There's a lot of reasons for that. Electric compression, all of those things, again, for trying to take steps on a more environmentally sound, but it created this interdependency issue that made it worse. So it's It is a hugely complex issue, and the team, I think, really tried to boil it down to the essential factors. It wasn't our mandate to basically pick winners coming out, more to identify, address these issues of reliability and resilience. These are the steps that we need to make. These are the investments that we need to make, and so that's where we focused, and candidly, I think in talking with the committee, we really tried to focus on the issue of being, technology agnostic, not picking a particular solution that was out there. They all have pluses and minuses, and the question is, well, regardless of how we pick all these mixes, there isn't a silver bullet. How do we ensure that reliability and resilience is the outcome that we achieve? Mark, Oliver, back to you.
Agreed. And when we met with legislators in April at the Texas ASCE Legislative Drive-In, each time we discussed the energy aspect of legislation, we, because of your question, specifically stated that we were agnostic as it relates to approaches, but the focus has to be on reliability and resilience, because the lack of having reliability and resilience across the entire civil and electrical grid infrastructure is what created the disastrous consequences that were exposed during Uri and Viola. And Texas citizens care about having life-sustaining systems, and those life-sustaining systems don't just include electricity. They include being able to access potable water and being able to communicate, particularly in emergency situations. So cell towers and telecommunications have to function so that emergency responses can continue to occur. And so we focused on the totality of civil infrastructure, and repeatedly in our legislative discussions expressed a desire for agnostic interests.
Okay. All right, I don't see any other questions posted, but let me make sure that we did address those last two. Just as a follow-up, the audits brought up wind and solar, and whether or not, we should be focusing on environmentally sound, and that's a subjective term. Recommendations to move a grid towards it being environmentally sound. Is it fair to say from both of you that the availability of wind and solar during the time of Uri and Viola, it didn't help at all? So the mission of our committee might need to evolve or change a little bit if we wanted to look into how to feasibly continue to develop those non-dispatchable renewable energy sources.
Well, certainly, and I believe Geoff would speak to this. The continuing expansion of battery storage systems tied to capturing excess power generated by wind and solar. As battery storage increases, that factors into the use of wind and solar as a more dispatchable kind of option for the grid. Geoff?
No, I would agree with that. I think it provides a what I'll call kind of a firming capability to intermittent generation, and that's it's a very a positive potential there. The key is, do you have sufficient duration on the resource, and do the economics also make sense? There were some challenges during Uri and Viola from storage. such that at the same time that customers were in the dark and unable to get power, batteries were recharging, which really create. And there's a good example of, you know, it's a good part of the solution, but the way the rules and regulations work actually set up some counter incentives that arguably made it worse. And that's not to say those can't be overcome, because they absolutely can. And same thing as the technology is continuing to improve. So we believe that there isn't, quote, a silver bullet out there, and that we need to be looking at all, but we also need to make sure that we're measuring that against reliability and resilience and the objectives there. And I'll just say, just from active discussions I'm having right now for a particular client I'm working with, they have a 24/7 load that they want to have 100% renewable for. And the challenge of providing that from leading renewable suppliers is not without its challenges, because, you know, regardless, we want your plant to operate. Well, you'll pay for whatever is getting produced from it. Okay, well, now what are the little details of how that gets made up? And these are the practical realities that, again, we're not pointing fingers. We're not saying one works and one doesn't, because I've developed wind, love wind projects. I like what they produce. I like the opportunity that wind and storage and solar all provide. But we also have to kind of be grounded in the, how's that impacting the reliability and resilience that people expect.
All right. One last comment from Otis, and then we'll wrap it up. Not a question, but he thanks us for our work in this presentation. Appreciate that, and I appreciate everybody involved. Right on schedule now. Thanks to everyone for participating in today's ASCE Texas Section Technical Webinar.
And great set of questions.
Yes, excellent
Thank you.
questions.
Yes.
Thank you all.
I'm very grateful to my colleagues, Geoff and Oliver, for putting on such a quality, informative program.